Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the workshop number 3 on cumulative regional impact assessment as a part of the CRC Time annual forum. Welcome. My name's Renee Young. I'm the Program Director for Conservation and Restoration at the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute, and also Program Lead on Project 1.1 within CRC Time on cumulative regional impact assessments. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of which I'm speaking to you from today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and those traditional owners from wherever you might be joining us from around Australia or even internationally. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So just some Q&A before we some housekeeping before we get started. You will have heard this in the other sessions. Please do use the live Q&A chat to lodge your questions. We'll probably have a question session at the end following all of our speakers today, and pop them in that Q&A section, not in the discussion forum, as the discussion forum won't be monitored. At the end of our presentations today, as I said, we'll have some Q&A and speak to all of each of our panelists, and we'll also have a Jamboard set up that's got some questions, so you'll have the opportunity to comment and get your thoughts down there in relation to what you've heard today around cumulative regional impact assessments and where we're proposing to go with the project over the next sort of 3 to 5 years. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tom Hatton. Tom was appointed to the WA EPA in 2014 and served as the chairman between 2015 and 2020. He chaired the Independent Expert Scientific Committee on Coal Seam Gas and the Great Large Coal Mining Development, and the National Sustainability Council, as well as the inquiry into hydraulic fracture simulation in Western Australia. He served on the WA Conservation Commission as the chair of the WA Marine Parks and Reserves Authority, and has held many other prestigious positions. He's an adjunct professor at the UWA Oceans Institute and directs Thomas Hatton Environmental Consulting. Today, Tom is going to introduce the cumulative impacts topic, presenting on the increasing focus of cumulative impacts in planning and development. Thank you very much, Tom, and welcome to the stage.
Kaya, thanks. I give introduce the notion of cumulative impacts, which means changes caused by the combined impact of past, present, and future activities and natural processes. Now, that is a deceptively simple but notion, but it is complex in application. First, it requires more than just an accounting of changes in some value, but it also requires an accounting of past, present, and foreseeable pressures that cause change in that value. And thus, it is not only descriptive, but also predictive and attributive. And it is also limitless in its potential breadth of application. For example, the lifestyle pressures that have accumulated on an individual's health and the consequences not only to current health, but likely mortality, as my cardiologist recently reminded me. But in the context of the resources sector, it could be the considerations of cumulative impacts on regional infrastructure, on cultural heritage or culture more generally, on community health, on global markets, and of course, it could be the cumulative impacts on the natural environment, which has been my professional focus. And so while the bulk will be in that context of the environment, it is not nearly inclusive of the broader considerations of cumulative impacts on or from the resources industry, for example. Now, the notion of cumulative impacts on the environment is as ancient as our nomadic ancestry. The idea and its protocols relating to fresh hunting grounds or grazing grounds completely conform to our modern definition, if not by name. This is not a new idea. It's inherent in our culture. The conceptual roots of cumulative impacts on the environment by name are typically traced back to the 1970s, with the growing awareness of the consequences of rapid population and economic growth and the need to account for and project into the future the consequences of multiple environmental, to multiple environmental values. Now, notable at that time, and I remember this as a kid, was the publication of two highly provocative books presenting analyses of past and forecast global pressures upon the environment, and thus the sustainability of development. That is The Population Bomb by Stanford's Paul and Ann Ehrlich, followed by Limits to Growth by researchers at MIT, which the latter is still the best-selling book on the environment after all these years. That emerging recognition of cumulative effects of multiple pressures on the environment resulted in two broad responses from governments around the world. As early as 1988 in the Netherlands, the beginning of State of the Environment reporting, which aimed to assess the fundamental drivers, pressures, states, and response of the environment across a jurisdiction. The second broad response was the consideration of cumulative impacts in environmental impact assessment, EIA. Beginning in the late 1970s, when it was realized that proposed development projects should not be assessed in isolation from surrounding land uses. In the US, cumulative effects consideration were introduced into environmental assessment regulations in 1979. They were introduced to the EU regulatory system in 1985 and into Canada in 1995. Cumulative impact assessments are at least implicitly required under the Epbc Act in this country, and now quite explicitly required under recent amendments to the Western Australia Environmental Protection Act. To show how seriously that is taken in practice in this state, for example, in 2019, the WA Minister for the Environment asked the EPA to suspend any further assessments of proposals in the Exmouth Gulf region until he could be provided with a more strategic overview of the cumulative impacts on the current and future state of the Gulf. So it is regularized and it is embedded as an expectation and regulation in this country. As far as Australia's SOE reporting goes, the State of Environment reporting, even after 25 years of national reports, our reach very much exceeds our grasp on these matters, as each one of those reports since 1996 has concluded. Our ability to report on Australia's state of the environment is greatly hampered by our inability to access existing data and associated analytics, for lack of what the recent Samuel review of the administration of the Epbc Act termed a national environmental information supply chain. Now, with respect to EIA, as it is currently practiced in Australia, each proposal may be asked to consider the cumulative impacts on those features of the environment under potential significant risk from the particular pressures associated with that development. Each time it is done de novo, it is done from scratch, at great expense for each proposal, or each proponent. Even the best of these assessments are of limited value beyond their immediate application simply because they are by nature bespoke. They only look at a limited set of environmental factors, not necessarily the values other regional stakeholders may be interested in. They do not consider all the additional pressures on the surrounding region. They do not, because they cannot, access all of the potentially available existing data because it is not routinely and systematically shared. The analytics used to assess impacts and risk are not shared and available for open testing and challenge, nor operationalized for open, ongoing use and improvement by others. Most importantly, perhaps, from day one following the completion of this approach to cumulative impact assessment and EIA, the value of the snapshot provided depreciates with new developments, new data, and new analytics. They go out of date very fast and have to be redone when needed. Next. So in very brief summary, cumulative impact analysis forms a basis and an explicit expectation for modern environmental planning and assessment. At the broadest level, environmental assessment incorporating cumulative impact analysis should be efficient and effective, but they are not yet. Both the ANAO audit and the Samuel review of the Epbc Act's administration say it is at present neither of these things, and that we need serious innovations in culture, regulation, and technology to achieve the needed information supply chain. But beyond those reasons and those assessments, we know that for scientific evidence to be effective in informing decision makers, cumulative impacts assessment must be three things. It has to be legitimate. That is, it must account for the impacts on the things that matter to all the region's stakeholders, not just matters of national environmental significance, and not just what matters to an individual proponent or regulator. And it must do so with transparency. Secondly, it has to be credible. It must have access to and make use of all the potentially available data and analytics, and must be subject to open review and improvement. And finally, it has to be salient. That is, it must remain current and relevant. And thus it must become a sustained and shared system of contemporary data and analytics. At least from the relatively narrow perspective of environmental application, these are the features which the partnership between WA's Biodiversity Sciences Institute and Marine Science Institution have been developing for a shared analytical framework for the environment to continue the revolution in environmental information driven out of Western Australia. And I will look with interest to see how that development could potentially contribute to a wider framework that considers the many other forms of impact resulting from the resources sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was a fantastic introduction to cumulative impacts and really set the scene for our upcoming presentations. So thank you very much. We will hold questions until the end. Just a reminder to everybody, please do get those questions in, submit them in the live Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and we'll resolve to get to as many of them as we can later on. Our next speaker is Declan O'Connor-Cox. Declan is the Assistant Secretary of the Environment Protection Reform Branch at DOR, so Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Declan's branch is responsible for leading the reforms to the Epbc Act, Australia's national environmental law informed by the recommendations of the recent independent review of such act. Prior to that, Declan was a delegate under the Epbc Act with responsibility for making approval decisions under the Act for developments. And Declan is going to shed some insight into the activities that at the federal level in relation to cumulative impacts, presenting work on the development of the DOR regional case study for planning and development. So thank you very much for joining us, Declan. It's great to have you here. I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity and for the invitation. Today, I want to get across a few key messages. So I'll be talking about, as per the a case study where we are attempting to develop a regional planning scheme. The key messages that I want to get across are what the Commonwealth means by a regional plan in this context, how we might use it to better assess and manage cumulative impacts, and the fact that this is something new for us. And so this comes with all that entails with testing something new, and I'll go through that. So firstly, with regards the review of the Epbc Act, the 10-yearly statutory independent review of Australia's national environmental law, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, was released earlier this year. The reviewer, Professor Graham Samuel, found that the Act was not working for the environment, for the community, or for business, and requires significant reforms. Professor Samuel made far-reaching recommendations. The government is taking a staged approach to considering and responding to those recommendations in consultation with stakeholders and partners. This approach, a staged approach, is consistent with Professor Samuel's findings that fundamental reform requires reforms to be undertaken and delivered in stages. This will enable, over the course of this work, for the government to deliver a holistic response to the review. In June this year, the Minister for the Environment released 2 documents, one entitled A Pathway for Reforming National Environmental Law and a proposed timeline for Epbc Act reforms. And together these documents describe the central first priority reforms that the government is currently undertaking, the government's staged response to reforming Australia's national environmental laws informed by the Epbc Act review, and how the government intends to work with stakeholders in going through all of the recommendations of the review. While the priority reforms are around single-touch environmental approval processes underpinned by new national environmental standards with monitoring, there are some initial reforms that I do want to talk about. I can describe what I mean by single-touch environmental approval processes in more detail if required, but basically single-touch approvals will involve the removal of duplicative Commonwealth approval processes where the Commonwealth accredits states and territories assessment and approvals of the Commonwealth. Just move to the next slide. So the key recommendations, or a key set of recommendations of the Epbc Act review, concern a greater focus on planning, including regional planning. And regional planning will help to identify and protect important environmental assets and hopefully lead to better environmental outcomes. As well, hopefully it will give business greater certainty and clarity of their environmental approval pathway by helping to identify the most for development. In response to Professor Samuel's recommendations about regional planning, the Australian government has allocated $2.7 million over 3 years to support the development of a regional plan in conjunction with a willing state or territory. So what do I mean by a regional plan in this context? So a regional plan is a plan that outlines the environmental and heritage objectives of a particular area on a regional scale, and the relevant actions to be taken that are permitted to achieve those objectives, and taking into account economic and social considerations. Regional plans, the intent is to make the plan under relevant provisions of the Epbc Act. So the Minister can develop, in consultation with stakeholders, a bioregional plan under Section 176 of the Epbc Act. So I'll be using the terms bioregional plan and regional plan interchangeably. For the most part, I'll use the term regional plan, but just note that under the Epbc Act, the term bioregional plan is used. Under Section 37A of the Act, the Environment Minister may declare that certain actions and classes of actions, so developments, for example, under a regional plan can occur without the need for separate approval under the Epbc Act, where those activities are conducted in accordance with the plan. So that gives the clarity and streamlining for the business sector. In terms of the approach that we're taking, so we're using a collaborative and stepwise approach to this work, and that's because the reasons for this approach are that the Commonwealth has not really used regional planning in this context before in this way. So we need, and an additional reason is that we need a willing state or territory partner for this to be successful. So while the Commonwealth has developed marine bioregional plans, we have not developed terrestrial bioregional plans. So this is a first. And so the first step is we need to develop a regional planning framework, which outlines what the regional plan is to achieve. And that's an important step. $2.7 million is not a lot of money if you look at it over the 3 years, and it's certainly not enough to do everything that we need to do for a successful program. We need to get data and we need to develop the plan. So we need to partner with a willing state or territory. Collaborating will ensure that we get the input from the stakeholders that we need and the experts that we need, and that those involved in the development know what they're in for. So, the willing state or territory partner knows the amount of work that they need to put in to get the data and develop the plan. So the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment will be undertaking the development of the regional plan initiative in 4 stages. Firstly, the development of a regional planning framework. That's due to be completed early next year. The selection of a priority region, the location for the regional plan early next year. Then the development of a regional plan over 2022 and 2023, and evaluation in 2024, the first half. So the initial work focusing on the development of the framework will focus on developing the framework to describe the principles and desired outcomes, and this will include consultation with states and territories, Indigenous peoples, other Commonwealth agencies, regional planning experts, etc. Choosing a priority region will need to be between the Commonwealth and states and territories, and you can imagine that the criteria for developing a regional plan will be that there are matters of national environmental significance, of course, in the area to be covered by the plan, and some development pressure perspective in the future that will impact on those matters, and a willing state or territory. The independent review of the Act identified that regional plan comprehensive protection of important environmental assets while streamlining regulatory processes, and potentially also supporting targeted investment in environmental management and restoration. We hope that they will allow development assessments to move from the current project by project focus to a more strategic approach to environmental management. And this will involve assessment and management of cumulative impacts and key threats, streamline development assessments, and provide business with that certainty when they want to expand or establish new operations in an area where a regional plan exists. So regional plans will provide those clear rules for managing competing land uses and provide a basis for development decisions. So for instance, regional plans will identify where developments can proceed in a location covered by a regional plan without the need for a referral assessment and approval under the Epbc Act, areas where development should not occur, and the rule set for other areas covered by the plan. A landscape scale approach will be able to better manage cumulative impacts and offers the potential to take a more, to manage things like offsetting in a more strategic landscape scale way. Regional plans could have priorities for restoration to address historical impacts in consultation with the community, and this would allow environmental management and restoration to be potentially coordinated within that region to achieve optimal outcomes. Again, the plans will reduce administrative burden on businesses for projects that previously would have needed to undergo multiple assessments levels of government. And regional plans could expand the scope and coverage of single touch approvals to areas and activities beyond those accredited in an approval bilateral agreement. I might go to the last slide now, and this is a tool for communication that we've developed. So on a page, on a placemat, this slide shows and outlines all of the key elements, what we mean by a regional plan, the process and timeline, and the benefits. We will look to use this placemat once it's finalised as a key information tool. And that's my presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Declan. It's fantastic and really insightful to see what is happening at the federal level, and the alignment that I think is apparent between the Commonwealth and what's happening in some of the states. So thank you very much for your insightful presentation, and I look forward to a couple of incoming questions shortly. We'll now move on to our third presenter, Kate Holland. Kate is a principal research scientist at CSIRO, Land and Water, with over 20 years of experience using multidisciplinary investigations to support policymakers, industry and regulators. She was the CSIRO project lead for the 4-year Geological and Bioregional Assessment Program. Kate will highlight the role of cumulative impacts in the Ecological and Bioregional Assessment Program, the Gba, which examined the potential impacts on water, the environment, protected areas and threatened species. So welcome to the stage, Kate, and we'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Renee. So look, I'm here, as Renee said, all of my introduction. Talking about geological and bioregional assessments. When I say GBA, that's what I mean, just giving you a heads up around the acronym. I want to talk about, I guess, the program encompassed a whole lot of assessment, but I want to talk particularly about the spatial causal networks and Gba Explorer today. I'm joining you today from Paramount Country in the Adelaide Hills. Before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the people who've worked on the program over the past 4 years, and I won't list them all, but people from the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, and the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. I'd particularly like to acknowledge those who helped us deliver stage 3 of the assessment, and I've listed all of our friends on the bottom of this slide. So GBA started in 2017 and comprised of 3 stages. So in stage 1, we identified which basins were more prospective for gas. In stage 2, we compiled existing geological and environmental information and identified knowledge gaps for further investigation in stage 3. In stage 3, we developed and tested a new method, a spatial causal network, to support future decision making. We also designed and delivered multidisciplinary field and modelling investigations to address the knowledge gaps identified in stage 2. 3 basins were selected: the Cooper Basin in Queensland and South Australia, the Isa Super Basin in Queensland, and the Beetaloo Sub-Basin in Northern Territory. The Isa Super Basin assessment was halted at the end of stage 2 due to insufficient geoscience and environmental data and information at the time. A highlight of the program was our regular meetings with the 3 user panels. Our discussions with them helped identify what matters in the region and also how to better communicate our complex science. We had about 100 scientists who worked with the regional communities and stakeholders through these user panels for each region. We also collaborated with experts from our technical peer review group and the state and Commonwealth governments. The assessments cover an area almost as big as the state of Victoria and provide a comprehensive knowledge base to help decision makers from government and industry to better understand where to look more closely and where risks are of low concern when they're assessing development proposals in the future. It's important to remember that this is a regional assessment and it doesn't replace site-specific assessments required under state, territory or Commonwealth law. So this is the graphical abstract from the methods paper for the spatial causal networks, and it summarised the assessment from setting the context to interpreting the results and developing a monitoring plan. We invite you to read the paper to better understand the method. There's also a fact sheet and short technical report on the GBA website. To do the assessments, we developed this new method that maps out the cause and effect relationships between the development activities, the things you need to develop the resource, and the endpoints, the things you care about. In this case, the yellow-footed rock wallaby shown here. This lets us identify which activities are of concern to which endpoints and where this occurs in the landscape. The causal network describes the entire conceptual model of the systems in the region, including the geology, groundwater, surface water, and ecology, as well as all of the development activities, stresses, and processes. The method's based on a traditional risk assessment and uses systematic, transparent and robust evaluations of the likelihood, consequence and effects of mitigation strategies on potential impacts. It also considers the effect of confidence and knowledge gaps for each of the cause and effect relationships and identifies where detailed local scale assessment, management and monitoring should focus for future resource development proposals. There's a link to the... So just getting into the details of the method systematically answers 4 questions for each link in the network. This flowchart steps through these 4 questions. First of all, is the link possible? Then, if it's possible, does it lead to a material change? If it's possible and material, can it be avoided? If it cannot be avoided, can it be mitigated? By systematically going through these questions, we address the core aspects of any risk assessment, namely the likelihood, consequence, and avoidance or mitigation. In the causal network, we've documented and justified the logic for each of these evaluations. By way of example, the causal network for the Cooper GBA region consists of 75 nodes, and there are 268 links and almost 3,000 pathways. So for the Cooper, we evaluated these 4 questions for each of the 268 links in the network. In terms of evaluating pathways, I just wanted to show you a couple of examples from our hypothetical causal network. The legend for the link evaluations and level of concern is in the top right corner of the screen. The top example is of an indirect pathway from transport of materials and equipment to a threatened species endpoint. The pathway is evaluated as not possible because the transport activity will not cause more cats or foxes to enter the region, the first green link. This means that the pathway from the transport activity through the invasive carnivores node is of low concern for threatened species. The second example is of a direct pathway from drilling to an endpoint representing aquifer condition. In this example, wells need to be drilled to enable production and drilling needs water, which can be sourced from groundwater. Increased groundwater extraction will occur, but aquifer drawdown can be mitigated under existing regulatory requirements. The links in the pathway are evaluated as possible, material and unavoidable, but can be mitigated, the purple links. Therefore, pathways from the drilling activity through the groundwater extraction node are of potential concern for the aquifer condition endpoint. Each node and link is supported by literature review, modelling, expert opinion and maps for the evaluations and also the impacts associated with each node. A real challenge for the assessment was about how do we define the resource development pathway, as proponents are still in the exploration phase. This is also relevant to managing mine legacy issues, as we can't always know where development will occur in the future. The spatial causal networks assume that resource development is possible across the entire region. The evaluations use the relative prospectivity estimates of the resources in the region to work out where development is more or less likely to occur. This gives an estimate of the overall spatial footprint and estimates of development intensity in a particular area in terms of number of access roads, amount of water, disturbance areas, etc. In the Bekele at the top, the FAST scenario was equivalent to the Gale development scenario developed for the Pepper inquiry into hydraulic fracturing. In the Cooper, the FAST scenario was equivalent to current conventional gas production. The figures at the bottom summarise the assessment results in the Cooper, showing the prospective area on the left, a summary of the potential impacts for each node and endpoint in the network in the middle, and a map of overall levels of concern for the Cooper on the right. Here's an example of a small part of the causal network for the Cooper GBA region. Using Gba Explorer, we can delve into the scientific evidence in more detail. Here, we've selected all of the pathways leading to the Winton-Mukunda aquifer condition endpoint. We can see the endpoint description, which includes the monitoring, mitigation strategies and knowledge gaps. Then we've got the spatial extent of the endpoint, and the next map shows the overall impact results for all causal pathways to the endpoint. There's also summary tables that show the areas in each endpoint associated with pathways through each of the activities, stresses, and processes. We developed Gba Explorer as an online interactive visualization tool to present the scientific evidence and logic that underpin the assessments in context, instead of as big, long technical reports. Users can untangle the pathways, focus on what matters to them, look at interactions, and explore the scientific evidence in detail. This includes the evaluations, potential impacts, material change definitions, as well as the regulatory and management controls and monitoring objectives, all in the context of the structure of the causal network. Before we finish, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions from our stakeholders in the regions, including traditional owners and members of the regional community, as well as government, industry, other land users, and the technical peer review group. We're keen to keep developing this method and to work on examples outside of the gas industry. We think it could be useful in the move to digital environmental assessments, and are also interested in how it could be used to manage and prioritise legacy issues associated with mining and other activities. Thanks for your attention, and we invite you to explore the fact sheets, reports, journal papers and datasets, all available through the GBA website. There's also a link to the Gba Explorer from the GBA website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was fantastic, and it's really great to see one of these tools live and being worked on, and the potential opportunities for its expansion. So thank you very much, and yeah, really great and insightful presentation. We'll now move on to our fourth speaker, Dr. Jenny Pope. Jenny has over 30 years experience in the fields of environmental management and sustainability in Western Australia and internationally. She's currently a member of the WA EPA and director of the West Australian consulting firm Integrals to Sustainability, which works with businesses and government to integrate sustainability objectives and strategies into decision-making processes and operational practices. Jenny is working with us on Program 1.1 and will provide insights from that framework, from that project on towards a framework for cumulative regional impact assessment. Thank you very much, Jenny, and welcome to the stage.
Thanks a lot, Renee. I'd like to start custodian from which I'm speaking to you, the people, and my response and emerging. For 1.1 for this is really that for mine closure environment is at a region, and we also particularly strong communities. Mitigate both the legacy the biological impacts, process of closure for the community. The situation is compromised within things as mining regions transition. It's all happening at once generate cumulative. How this actually in a region such as the diversity, the resilience of the base, the environmental at the point of closure, things that might be happening. The guide on the assessment and the regional scale knowledge, and that's really now for this project. Renee presented today, but I'll just highlight the three components to it. Review case that the project has developed a draft framework for regional closure, research priority, just talking most and about how it's included the grade to get the draft elements of this framework. I mentioned that just really for the last this is really to review pro. Tom just wanted to put up this particular impacts as incremental, both positive and negative of an activity on society. Single or multiple mining and as well as the interact past present. Nothing to do. This definitely is mining, which was on the coal industry, and it's plantation impact and how they manifest and how they can mine. A couple of key at this definitely just about the incremental difference. Sometimes cumulative impact difference of them everybody else aware of difference, but the highlight is impacts a collective environment or the community from everything that's going on, and that's really about regional impact assessment. Another important is that impact in different ways. They can purely logistic, complex part. Important to understand just what's going on. How things interact with each other. Might be really understanding. We focused on and it became apparent as we went through the literature that term cumulative is actually quite distinct. Of cumulative impact, which can be applied at the regional level. This form is assessment that's undertaken by proponents as part of the as part of that approval to look at the impact of your proposal, and in fact the way is rolling out this that explain how to do the requirement Protection Act assessment form, but it's rather about the cumulative impact happening in a region, right? Kind of how do we get to where we are? And study of WA recently undertaken. What's there, what the situation is in our future. Well, but it was primarily about understanding what. Form 3 impact assessment. This is a regional plan. The kind of planning that example of this kind of assessment. Strategic assessment of things. And form is the ongoing assessment of what's actually, which could be after such a, and in that is the essential the accused were indicators identified which cumulative impacts. From this, really helped us to clarify the about negative impact on closure, convince, planning to close, understanding and with closure and transition. So therefore it occurs a regulatory area of is even also well beyond the capacity of the company. Both backward and forward regimes for mining. When we think about that really the least relevant of those. And that we're looking at framework that we're is a combination of four. Show down the point at which consideration of legacy start of the project. And then assessment, forward planning, and ultimately to manage and monitor the impact time. So the advanced forms really provided us grey literature, which we are in the form of guidance documents, and that to start drawing a original cumulative disclosure. In that process, literature and actually a policy is really a form of impact assessment of the process directly particularly to do. A lot of cumulative in this sort of methodology components, it was reviewed that literature, acknowledging that it was, but we had to be careful, abstracted from it. Quick kind of work. I look at the different features. There was guidance on assessment. There was on planning and guidance, and go at I find which of those four forms most closely. It was never complete. Because we're different forms which act as for the cumulative impact in that process, and stayed right those frameworks. We elements of frame. There are four. The first stage, and that's really defining the spatial and the theme right through this whole project. Exactly. Assessment with the government, whether it should be a development aid, operations of mining companies. Yeah, it's fairly. It's 2, 3, and 4 forms. 2, 3, and 4 of cumulative assessment. So stage 2 evaluation. It's where you identify that your social colour. And then you know the approach that we expect. Really about how do we get to where we and some of the current status for they're operating and standing. Stage 3 is so it's about us for the future development during land, during the and transition assessment as to identify which we should most approach. This will be part of once the monitoring those cumulative impacts set some role to play and engagement, land and decision making, and management. I guess that's the skill of a framework. There's still much, and some of the areas that have been projects picked up in subsequent explicitly into stakeholder methods in data is a recurring theme. What exactly define a real is it a cultural thing and governance and leadership? And I think that's a big question. Emerge versus regulatory might be national human disclosure. One, the scope be how looking at other activities region, unclaimed closure. So they're still studied, but we've got that the base as to forward.
Thank you very much, Jenny. To the audience, I do apologise if there was some audio issues during that presentation. From the back end, we could hear fine, but we did get some reports that it was distorted. So we will make sure that you get copies of those slides, and if you need to follow up at any questions, please do feel free to get in contact with us, and we can get back to you straight away. Our final presenter today is Chris Gentle. Chris has over 20 years experience consulting at a strategic level within the information management industry for natural resources and government sectors. He has specialised knowledge in developing and implementing location intelligence strategies and leading ICT strategy implementation planning for resource infrastructure capital projects. Chris is the Program Director for Biodiversity Data Information Management at the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute. And following on from Jenny's approach, Chris is going to provide an update from his CRC Time project, which is CRC Time Project 4.1, on dynamically transforming environmental assessment through shared analytic framework. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee, and good afternoon, everybody. Before I start, can I acknowledge that I'm presenting today on behalf of the whole team of Project 4.1, which includes significant work by Dr. Claire Coate and Dr. Pascal Asmussen as well. So coming today, my task in trying to wrap up, I'm going to come to you today a little bit more from a data nerd perspective, and thinking about how the critical success factors and the drivers we need to really work towards digitally transforming environmental assessment, which has been a passion and a vision for certainly myself and the extended team that we work with. Our recent run at this started in 2017. And the mission that we've given ourselves in that pathway has really been, how do we understand the cumulative impact of an action on a region over time? Economic terms, while streamlining environmental assessment or approvals, or in plain English, by 2025, how do we make every assessment strategic? From our perspective, that requires a high volume of quality data. It's got to be able to be shared, need a place to put it, workflow tools to enable process efficiencies, and analytic tools around decision support. That needs to be open and shared by state and Commonwealth regulators, proponents, and community, which will lead to the benefits there in points 4 through 7, but really around efficiency for a proponent, confidence for a regulator that they're making the correct decision with the right conditions, and increasingly at a cumulative scale, leading to improved trust and transparency in the decision-making process and the methods which actually underpin that decision-making process. So we've been working our way through a process. I'm going to make a case today, and I'll get to a case study in the Bowen in a second, that we've got 3 disruptions if we're going to work our way through this. The first one is data. Consistent, comprehensive and trusted supply of data working our way through. That's from both government and industry. Second is going to be digital. How do we start working in digital systems in terms of EIA, getting away from emailing very large PDFs and such things between proponents and regulators. And the third one is where the fun stuff is from my perspective, which is how do we put that data and those digital systems to work in terms of decision support, hindcasting, which we've spoken about today, current in terms of baseline and state of environment, and to pick up from Jenny's point around forecasting, what do we think the future impacts on a value of a new set of pressures might be. The approach that we're taking is to try and, in plain English, robust, repeatable, sustainable. But if I had to, it's how do we work as a collective with industry and government and the research community to operationalise fundamentally what Kate's team has been working about. So how do we get out of project mode and start thinking that this is a transition where data is flowing, we've got digital systems and decision support tools which are helping to inform a set of conversations and predictions around cumulative, but it's happening in a regular operational context as opposed to a project by project type exercise. 3 drivers there: the efficiency for proponents, confidence for regulators, and transparency for community, and 3 customers for this thing. First is going to be the assessment process, the EIA that we've been talking through now. Second is likely to be around assurance or monitoring or condition reporting, etc. And the third one is how do we account for the benefits of this, either in terms of environmental and economic accounts, financial disclosures, various things, i.e. carbon that credit baselines. How do we inform? Which is really just pushing out that vision at the bottom around the individual assessments leading to shared repositories, digital tools to get us to our end game of operationalised bioregional environmental assessment. So the case study that we've been working with the CRC on was in the Bowen. And the Bowen was picked, again, to Declan's points, because it's a region that has a series of key properties to it. One is it's economically valuable for the Australian community. It's environmentally valuable and environmentally sensitive for, again, Australian community and specifically for the locals and others with a vested interest in that specific region. The third one is, of course, it's contentious in terms of what it is and how it does, and it's developed and managed in kind now, such that cumulative is quite important in that specific area. So the team started to work through what actually happens in terms of the Bowen, in terms of EIA, what data is collected, how often, etc., how we might value it, and how we might put it to work. So that was done through a series of interviews. It's probably 40 different stakeholders within the Bowen area. And you can see some of the information types that were queried and talked about in that specific side of things. Findings from it. So I won't read these. You'd be perhaps positively surprised. Basically, the data is valuable. It was acknowledged as such.
Could I interrupt you? We're not seeing your slides.
Oh. Well, that'll be a dull talk.
You've been talking very eloquently, and we haven't needed them, but might be worth, now you're talking to them, that we can see them.
I do apologise, Renee, and to everyone else. Screen says it's sharing.
I can't see them just yet.
How did I go? Is that operator error?
Oh, there we go. We've got them as in your PowerPoint. If you go full screen, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so apologies for that. I've just reset that, and that's come through. Okay, I'll push on in the. In fact, just because it's quite, I'll very quickly go back. So this is the acknowledgement slide. Thank you to Claire and Pascal. This is our talking about cumulative impact of inaction on a region, the high volumes of data, etc. This is our disruptions, and we'll make all these slides available, but really down the bottom is the key thing. How do we get away from individual assessments to shared repositories using digital tools for the purpose of efficiency, confidence and transparency, and ultimately, from our perspective, operationalising the bioregional environmental assessment process. For the Bowen, that's the region that we're talking about, and they're the data types that were there and just discussed briefly previously. So the findings coming out of that exercise. Look, there was universal agreement from the proponents, the regulator, and some of the consultants involved in that process as well, that the data is valuable and should be made publicly available. There were challenges that were put forward in terms of primarily legal, etc. And I'll talk about how some of those have been overcome in Western Australia momentarily. Access to the data from the historic EIS is currently problematic. When we say problematic, it's very problematic. It's hard to work its way through, which tells you that you need a systemic approach to capturing and managing. The data needs to be validated, which many companies do, and that there could be a regulation or regulatory type requirements around compliance, submission and validation processes. Also, interestingly, lots of conversation about the positive, the carrot for encouraging such sharing, some of which would be economic. So in terms of metrics, the EIS metrics for Queensland from 2000 to 2021. So effectively, there's been in the order, you can see there, the volume and side of things, how that's gone through. Each EIS takes an average of 2.5 years, and it's been reported that nearly 70% of this time is used by proponents and service providers to generate data models and reports. So effectively, one of the questions here is, how can we reduce that time by using shared data and analytics in that case? So that's the EIS metrics. The economist metrics, the yearly value of data collected, this is in that Queensland Bowen area, and this is just in the Bowen area, has been in the order of $2 million per EIS. If you average that out, that works out at around $12 million a year. They're conservative numbers in our opinion, and the majority of them come out of water. And if you then extrapolate that forward over the course of that 20 years from 2000 to 2021, in Queensland, in the Bowen, that's around $250 million, and that's just the data collection, which excludes modelling and excludes reporting. So in effect, there's been $250 million worth of energy into collecting environmental data for the purpose of EIS over the last 20 years, which in some ways you can consider as a value, as a balance sheet item. If you're an economist, it's actually a cost. So our challenge is actually to reduce that, to put that data to work such that we might get a benefit. In Western Australia, we've been working since 2018 under such a model where the EIA data is submitted to the regulators. We started with terrestrial biodiversity information in 2018. That's around $40 million of survey effort. That was extended in 2020 to the marine side of things, which added an additional $50 million worth of environmental data that is now submitted by law to the regulator on an annual basis. So the pitch there, the numbers are kind of similar. It simply says over the next decade in WA, with a similar type of approach to what's being discussed here in the Bowen, you're going to collect in the order of $1 billion worth of environmental information. So the question, of course, comes, how do you put it to work? So that's a cost. Let's talk in economist terms and talk benefit. There was work done in WA in 2019. WA Treasury and Commonwealth Treasury that said if you could save roughly 10% of the time it takes to do the EIA process for a certain set of categories, large projects with an average benefit of about average capital spend of about 400 mil, that you would save in the order of $150 million a year in terms of NPV to the state of WA. Or in cash terms or benefit terms, again, over your decade, $1.5 billion benefit to the community. So clearly the benefit for all of us of improving the efficiency of that exercise through data sharing and through shared analytics is there in terms of building a better understanding of the baseline environment, the data collection, the survey collection, etc. But the real win comes when you start to think about how could you use shared analytics to put that data to work, to enable some of the key outcomes that Declan spoke about earlier, and some of the key challenges that both Jenny and Tom addressed in that process. And if I had to, in plain English, it would be operationalising Kate and Kate's team's exceptional work in terms of the Gba process. So how can shared analytics help us with that? Well, the logic there of individual assessments to shared repositories to digital tools to operationalised bioregional assessment, it gives us a method to develop and articulate cumulative impact, again, operationalising that style of forecasting. It's a collaboration vehicle for linking access to data from the public, private and research organisations. It will support and improve trust and transparency in the dissemination of environmental data or reporting, either by a legal boundary or on country boundary. It'll help the regulators with decision support tools and proponents, forecasting tools and analytics. And lastly, it should help us to maintain the currency to help sustain monitoring and reporting such that we can start to improve our understanding of cumulative impact and also, most importantly, how we communicate that to our stakeholders. I apologise for the slides not showing earlier. And Renee, if it's okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chris. There were no problem. You spoke to them very well, so I think that we all followed along just fine. So thanks very much for all of that. Look, that brings us to the end of our speakers for today. So I'd like to thank them all for their time and giving us their thoughts on current perspectives within cumulative regional impact assessments. I'd like to invite the speakers to the stage, and we'll pose a few questions. So if the facilitators can do that, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Jenny, I take it you're on the line too, just not visual.
Yeah, yes, I've had to.
Great, thank you. No, that's no problem. Thanks very much. Yeah, okay, so thanks again, panel. To people joining in from around Australia, we're going to have a link that's going to be added to the discussion forum, which will take you to a Jamboard. There's a whole bunch of, there's some questions there around cumulative regional impact assessments and where that's heading as we think about mine closure in Australia from a regional perspective. An opportunity for you to make comments there. There's a little sticky note on the side. You can just add your comments in the relevant sections. We've got some great questions coming in, and I'd like to open with one. There's still time to get your question in if you haven't popped it up just yet. But I'd like to open this, start with one to the panel. Sorry, just getting my little scrolling. I'll go to Kate. Kate, what kind of resourcing in terms of time, people, funding were associated with building and delivering the GBA project, and how do we effectively and efficiently scale that to other regions?
So I think we'd like to know the answer to that as well. I guess the GBA program comes off of, it's almost 10 years now from bioregional assessments, and that was much bigger. That was up in the $90 million. GBA was 35 million. The numbers are getting smaller as we go through time because I think we get better at doing it. We've got a new program that's starting up, and that's in the tens of millions. Strategic basin plans, again looking at gas. But I think the team size, GBA, we had about 100 scientists. I think 200 for bioregional assessments, something like that. The new program, we're looking at 30. So, we're looking at, what are the bits that we can transfer in this method? How do we transfer them across to the same as you do for an environmental impact statement? There are lots of commonalities. So I think there's lots of opportunities for, taking the bits that will transfer and making sure that you've got local information as well, and building it in a modular way. We're very excited.
Great, thank you. We've got another question here. So there seems to be two dimensions in which we can think about cumulative assessing impact, transdisciplinary, so social, economic, environmental, and temporospatial across a region over time. And could the panel comment on how dimensions can be addressed in developing cumulative impact assessments as a basis for planning? Who would like to have a go at that one? Tom.
I'll give you my initial thoughts. It depends who the client is for the analysis. Under some jurisdictions and some authorities and regulators, they need the environmental assessment, the cumulative impact on things in the environment, to be actually separate and separated from social and economic analysis and provided independently. So to begin with, even just with that particular lens on the question, you have to be careful that you don't approach a problem with the tool where those things cannot be clearly separated. That's the first thing that comes to my mind when I read that question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Did anybody else have a thoughts or comments in response to that one? No? Declan, there's one here. Yeah, Jenny, please.
Your Tom's exactly right. That you kind of exclude Australia excludes much more beyond the Bible. I think that big one probably isn't a process that you need to look for between we understand the connections between everything. It's really that the not be constrained by limitations. One of that time is really kind of a good answer to that, but really understanding the baseline got to where we are. In a time and how things sort of as it started to which feedback might be fast moving. But I think the time is really important and some thought.
Thank you. Jenny, I think that we are having some audio issues with yours still, so apologies for that. Yeah. There was a question for Declan. Declan, can you elaborate on the framework that you mentioned and what that would look like, or is that still in development and being decided?
Yes, so it is still in development and being decided. I think the most important point to make is that this will be the first time that we've used those provisions I referred to in the Epbc Act to develop a terrestrial regional plan. And so our thinking is that we develop a framework which is developed in a collaborative way and which gets input from various stakeholders and experts so that we know what a regional plan is supposed to look like, achieve, what goes into it, and importantly, how do we ensure that the regional plan is fit for purpose in terms of the minister making a declaration where certain classes of actions that are undertaken in accordance with the plan don't need further Epbc Act approval. So that's probably you can imagine that's pretty tall order. So we want to see whether through that development process of the framework, we can provide some guidance or principles around how to achieve those things.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's going to be a true collaborative effort by all fronts. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but just before we go, there is the link in the discussion forum, which you can all access, and that Jamboard will stay live after the session, so you can complete it afterwards. But just a final question to you, Kate. Kate, can the spatial causal networks be updated as new knowledge becomes available?
Yeah, they're designed to be updated. We don't have any, projects ongoing at the moment. And Chris's point around operationalizing them, that was spot on. But yeah, they're modular. You can add in all sorts of endpoints. For if you've got social endpoints that you want to consider in your risk assessment, and you've got knowledge for how to build them in, speaking to that earlier question, it's a really modular approach in that way. So yes.
Right. Thank you. I think that we're probably going to be out of time. I would like to thank you all for your time and your engagement in this afternoon's discussions. We've had a really wide-ranging and informative session, so thank you very much. So in the Jamboard, you will see that we are going to be progressing, doing further work in cumulative regional impact assessments through CRC time as the projects and the CRC evolves. So if you would like to be engaged through that process and the next phase of the project, by all means do get in touch with me, either through email or on the Jamboard, and we can certainly loop you into those those conversations. Thank you all very much for a fantastic workshop and day, and we look forward to joining you again soon. Okay, bye.